The exile was not just a matter of geography. It was the shattering of identity, the disintegration of a spiritual framework that had once anchored every part of life. For the people of Judah, being carried off to Babylon was more than defeat. It was the unraveling of meaning. The temple, the city, the covenant, all seemed to have crumbled at once. In their place stood a foreign land with unfamiliar gods, customs, and language. Among the exiles, a young man named Ezekiel, born into the priestly line, found himself turning 30 in a land that knew nothing of the sacred duties he had trained his whole life to fulfill. That milestone, once meant to mark the beginning of his service in the temple, instead became the beginning of something no priest could have predicted. He stood by the Kebar River, not among the marble courts of Jerusalem, but among captives who had long since stopped singing the songs of Zion. It was there, in a land steeped in paganism and far from the sacred hill, that something happened. The heavens opened. The moment was not planned or ceremonial. It came without warning, like a thunderclap over dry ground. And in that moment, Ezekiel saw visions of God, visions that would not only redefine his life, but would carry the voice of the Almighty into a time of despair and silence. The God of Israel had not remained behind in the ruins. He had followed his people into exile, and now he was speaking. Ezekiel's calling did not emerge in comfort. It was forged in displacement. His priesthood, once tied to ritual and structure, was about to be reshaped by something far more dynamic, a prophetic fire that would burn not on altars, but in his very bones. He had been trained to serve through ceremonies and laws. Instead, he would now speak through visions and actions that defied the ordinary. Babylon, the seat of conquest, would become the place where God unveiled the next chapter of his covenant. And Ezekiel would be the chosen mouthpiece, not because of status or favor, but because his heart was still listening when so many others had turned away. The significance of Ezekiel's priestly heritage cannot be overstated. As the son of Buzi, he carried not just a lineage, but an expectation. Priests were meant to intercede, to teach, to uphold the sacred rhythms of Israel's worship. But now, with the temple in ruins and the sacrificial system halted, the role of the priest was seemingly suspended. Ezekiel, however, would find that the heart of priesthood was not confined to walls of stone. His calling would expand beyond rituals to become a vessel for God's presence in a world that no longer looked sacred. And in that transformation, he would not lose his identity. He would discover its truest form. The Babylonian exile was not simply punishment. It was a revelation. It exposed not only Israel's failure to uphold the covenant, but also the depth of God's commitment to restore it. Through pain and separation, a new kind of clarity emerged. God had not been defeated. His voice had not been silenced. He would speak through a man living among ruins, through visions no one else could see, through messages no one wanted to hear. The exile stripped away illusion, and what remained was the raw, unfiltered presence of a God who refused to abandon his people, even when they had abandoned him. Ezekiel's story begins not with triumph, but with a divine interruption in the middle of displacement. His visions would soon grow strange and intense, filled with symbols that would echo through generations. But before the wheels turned and the scrolls were consumed, before he lay on his side or saw bones rise again, there was a single, world-shifting truth. Even in Babylon, even by foreign rivers, the heavens could open. And when they did, everything changed. The moment the heavens opened before Ezekiel, time itself seemed to tremble. What unfolded next was not a dream, not a fragment of memory or imagination, but a revelation so intense it demanded new language, new symbols, and a new posture of awe. Ezekiel did not see a familiar sight. He did not behold a quiet whisper of divinity or a gentle light resting on the water. What he saw defied all earthly comparison. A storm cloud approaching from the north, flashing with lightning, surrounded by radiance, and within it, the likeness of 4 living beings. They did not walk or glide. They moved straight forward, never turning, their wings touching, their forms radiant with fire, each accompanied by a wheel unlike any wheel seen before. These were not the wheels of men. They were immense, intersecting one another, moving in unison with the creatures, and their rims were filled with eyes. This was not mechanical. This was not decoration. The eyes were not symbols of ornamentation, but of perception. Nothing escaped their gaze. Every direction was known, every path visible. The wheels moved as the Spirit moved, rising and falling not by force or design, but by divine will. Ezekiel stood not in the presence of chaos, but in the presence of ordered, majestic power, intelligent, watching, and alive. The living creatures, later known as cherubim, bore the likeness of a man, but each had 4 faces, one of a man, one of a lion, one of an ox, and one of an eagle. Each face revealed a different dimension of divine character. The human face spoke of wisdom and connection, the lion of authority and courage, the ox of endurance and service, and the eagle of vision and transcendence. These were not beings of myth, but of mystery. They were not figments of religious imagination, but the bearers of divine presence. They formed the foundation of the throne that moved, not bound to earth, not bound to temple, not bound to nation. The God of Israel was not seated on a throne confined to Jerusalem. He rode upon glory that filled the heavens and moved across the earth. Above the heads of the living creatures was an expanse, shining like crystal, awe-striking and pure. Over that expanse, a throne, and on the throne, the likeness of a man glowing like fire, surrounded by brightness. The vision concluded not with dread, but with something almost unbearable glory. Not simply light, but the radiance of a presence so holy, so complete, it made Ezekiel fall to the ground. He heard a voice, but first he saw majesty, and in that sight he was undone. This was the chariot of God, often called the Merkavah. But unlike earthly chariots, this was not built for war in the human sense. It was not designed to crush armies or showcase wealth. It was the expression of divine omnipresence. The wheels moved in every direction without turning. The eyes saw all things. The creatures carried a throne that was not fixed to a sanctuary, but alive and in motion. In this vision, heaven touched earth not with gentleness, but with terrifying clarity. This was not the distant God of philosophy. This was the living God who sees, who moves, who reigns over nations and empires alike. What Ezekiel saw was more than a vision. It was a declaration. The temple may have fallen, but the throne of heaven remained. Israel may have been in exile, but the God of Israel had not abandoned the world to silence. This chariot of glory rolled into Babylon, not to comfort, but to confront, not to whisper, but to thunder with holiness. The creatures did not speak, but their presence announced something unmistakable. God was still on the move. The details of the vision cannot be reduced to simple metaphor. Each component spoke of something deeper. The storm from the north reminded the exiles of past judgments, yet it also signaled divine action. The lightning and fire reflected the purity of God, a holiness that consumes impurity without hesitation. The coordinated motion of the creatures revealed a unity of purpose, a harmony not born of nature but of design. And the expanse above them, clear as crystal, reflected the separation between creation and creator. Even the most magnificent beings in heaven bowed under that expanse. And then, above it all, the throne. It was not empty. It was not silent. It held the likeness of one with the appearance of a man, glowing with fiery brightness, surrounded by radiance like a rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day. And that rainbow, the symbol of covenant from the days of Noah, appeared again, not to recall destruction, but to remind of mercy. What Ezekiel witnessed in that moment was a vision so layered, so spiritually dense, it would not only transform him but leave a mark on prophetic literature for generations. This was not a private revelation. It was a public proclamation written through symbols, sound, and fire. It marked a turning point, a shift from temple-bound worship to a prophetic ministry that carried the weight of glory into the places of despair. The vision said something about God, but it also said something about the world. God was not bound to geography, not confined by borders or buildings. His glory could travel, and in traveling, it could reach the lowest valleys and the most distant exiles. For the people of Israel, this vision shattered any illusion that Babylon was outside God's domain. It revealed a heavenly reality where power moved with eyes wide open, where nothing was forgotten, and where every motion was intentional. Ezekiel was not left to interpret this on his own. He did not construct this experience from fragments of his imagination. He saw what was revealed, and in that revelation, the future began to take shape, not with answers, but with awe. This was the God of glory, and that glory had wheels. Not long after the vision of the fiery chariot and the throne above the expanse, Ezekiel found himself before another encounter, one less dazzling in appearance but equally weighty in purpose. No longer was he simply a witness to glory. He was now to become a vessel for it. The task ahead was not to remain silent, not to retreat into wonder, but to carry a message that few would welcome. This time, the revelation came not in the form of flashing lights or living creatures, but as a scroll. And this scroll was not meant to be read aloud. It was meant to be consumed. The hand that extended toward Ezekiel held out something unexpected, a scroll unrolled before him. On both sides, inside and out, it was covered in writing, and its contents were not celebrations or promises, but lamentations, mourning, and woe. This was not poetry to soothe the heart. It was a word that burned. The scroll carried judgment, grief, and sorrow, written in ink drawn from a people's rebellion and a nation's shattered covenant. And yet, instead of handing it to Ezekiel to speak from, God commanded him to eat it. To eat the scroll was to take the message into himself, not only intellectually, but physically, spiritually, entirely. It was not enough to understand the message. The prophet had to become one with it. He had to embody it. His soul, his voice, even his bones would be shaped by the words he consumed. Ezekiel was not being asked to perform a role. He was being remade into a watchman, a sentinel who stands on the threshold between heaven and earth, between warning and silence, between truth and denial. And so he ate. And as strange as it sounds, he found the scroll sweet in his mouth. Despite the sorrow it carried, the obedience to the divine will brought a kind of sweetness. The prophet did not delight in judgment, but he found his place in the story. There is something profoundly personal about this act. It reveals how prophecy is not a speech delivered at a distance, but a burden carried within. The scroll could not be passed off or quoted. It had to live inside him. To be a watchman is to accept solitude. It is to live with eyes open when others would rather sleep, to hear things that unsettle, and to speak when silence is easier. Ezekiel was not called to popularity. He was not called to affirm the dreams of the exiles who still clung to false hopes of swift deliverance. His role was to stand firm on the wall of warning, to cry out when danger approached, and to be accountable not just for his own soul, but for those who would hear or ignore his voice. The charge given to him was not conditional. He was told that whether the people listened or not, he must speak. Their resistance was not an excuse for silence. Rebellion did not exempt them from hearing truth. And so the scroll in Ezekiel's stomach became more than words. It became a fire that drove him forward. This was no longer a private calling. It was a public commission, one that tethered his life to the fate of a nation. This role was not glamorous. He was warned that his face would be met with stone faces, his words with deaf ears. But God strengthened him. Just as his name foretold, he was made unyielding, not out of pride or arrogance, but out of necessity. If he wavered, the message would falter. If he hesitated, danger would overtake those unaware. The burden was not only to speak, but to be faithful in the speaking. The idea of a watchman brings with it the weight of responsibility. If he sees danger and does not speak, the blood of the people is upon him. If he speaks and they refuse to listen, their blood is on their own hands. This was not rhetorical flourish. It was the reality of divine justice working through human vessels. Ezekiel could not choose his audience or modify his message. He was chosen to be faithful, not successful by the standards of his listeners. And so his calling unfolded in layers. He was not merely a voice. He was a guardian of a sacred trust, one that demanded his entire being. Prophets in ancient Israel were not philosophers or sages offering good advice. They were lightning rods, absorbing the storm of divine emotion, judgment, mercy, sorrow, hope, and channeling it into language. Ezekiel had eaten the scroll. Now he would speak what was inside it. What makes this moment so arresting is that it speaks not just to Ezekiel's time, but to every age where truth must be spoken amid resistance. The scroll is always heavy, the burden always real. In every generation, there are watchmen, some who stand at the gates of families, others who guard communities, and still others who feel the fire in their bones and cannot remain quiet. To be a watchman is to see beyond the present comfort and to feel the gravity of what lies ahead. It is to love deeply enough to warn, even when warning wounds. For Ezekiel, the journey had truly begun. Not with thunder, but with ingestion. Not with applause, but with internal fire. He had seen the glory. He had tasted the message. And now he stood as one who would not only speak but embody the living word in a world too numb to hear. Ezekiel's voice, once filled with visions and oracles, suddenly fell into silence. But silence did not mean inactivity. It did not mean withdrawal or disengagement. Though his lips were sealed by divine command, his body became a living canvas for the messages he was called to deliver. In the absence of speech, every gesture took on weight. Every movement became charged with meaning. The prophet, now mute before the people, began to act out the word of the Lord in ways that seemed strange, unsettling, even absurd to the casual observer. Yet behind every symbolic act lay a deep urgency, a desperate divine attempt to awaken hearts dulled by disobedience and routine. The first of these actions came not with a proclamation, but with posture. Ezekiel was instructed to lie on his left side for 390 days, bearing the iniquity of the house of Israel, one day for each year of their sin. After that, he was to turn and lie on his right side for 40 more days, symbolizing the iniquity of Judah. He was not simply told to speak of judgment. He was asked to live it. Each day under the weight of that position, each moment facing the same direction without turning, was a testimony to time lost, to years wasted in rebellion, to the long patience of God waiting for hearts to return. This was not performance for attention. It was burden made visible. The people may have walked by, curious or indifferent, but Ezekiel lay there as a quiet sentinel, unmoved, unmoving, a sign of what had already been written in the heavens. The act forced them to consider the consequences of their history, not as abstract ideas, but as something their eyes could not ignore. Prophetic symbolism in this case was more powerful than 1,000 shouted words. It entered their routine, disrupted their assumptions, and lingered in their thoughts long after they walked away. Then came another act, equally difficult and layered with meaning. Ezekiel was commanded to prepare food using specific ingredients and to cook it over a fire made with human excrement. The reaction would have been immediate and visceral. The prophet, aghast, pleaded for a modification, and God allowed him to use cow dung instead. But the message remained. The food represented scarcity. The method represented defilement. It was an enacted prophecy of siege conditions, of the hunger and ritual impurity that would overtake Jerusalem when the final judgment came. In that action, God was not mocking the people's plight, but warning them of what their own choices were about to bring upon them. What might have seemed offensive or extreme in presentation was, in reality, a cry of mercy, a plea for them to change course before it was too late. Each of these symbolic acts demanded more than courage. They demanded the surrender of personal dignity. Ezekiel's reputation, his status, his comfort, all were placed on the altar of obedience. When he shaved his head and beard with the sword, dividing the hair into thirds, one part burned, one struck with the blade, and one scattered to the wind, it was not a ritual of mourning. It was a pronouncement. Hair, in the culture of the time, represented honor and identity. For a priest to shave his head was a radical statement. The destruction of the hair mirrored the coming destruction of Jerusalem. One part to be consumed by fire, another by violence, another exiled and dispersed. But even here, a remnant was preserved. A small portion of the hair was tucked into his robe, and from it, a few strands were thrown into the fire again. The message was layered. Yes, judgment was coming, but not without purpose. Even the remnant would face refining. Nothing would be untouched. Yet nothing would be done without reason. To many, these acts may have seemed like madness. But madness is only perceived in the absence of understanding. Ezekiel was not seeking attention. He was drawing attention to what had been ignored for too long. In a culture where prophetic warnings had become background noise, where words alone no longer stirred the soul, God used action. Where ears had closed, eyes were forced to see. This was divine drama, not for entertainment, but for rescue. God's mercy often appears in forms we least expect. And in this case, it came through a man who allowed his body, his habits, even his silence, to speak louder than any sermon. The silence Ezekiel kept was not passive, it was disciplined. Every day, he lived out symbols that echoed the grief of heaven and the urgency of the hour. He became a parable in motion, a walking prophecy, a living cry. His silence was not absence, it was presence intensified. The people who would not listen now had to watch. And in watching, they could not easily dismiss what they saw. These dramatic symbols did not only declare judgment, they also revealed something about God's heart. The extreme nature of the acts did not come from a distant, indifferent deity, but from one who longed to be heard, who bent every rule of human communication to reach the soul. God was not toying with the people through Ezekiel. He was pursuing them. Each strange act was a gesture of compassion, not cruelty. The absurdity of the symbols matched the absurdity of the sin they refused to confront. Ezekiel's life, then, became a bridge between the divine and the broken. His silence became the loudest message of all. And in that silence, God was speaking. Through posture, through ashes, through divided hair and rationed bread, a voice emerged that could not be silenced. The prophet had become a mirror, reflecting the depth of divine grief and the urgency of repentance. It began not with thunder, but with movement. Subtle at first, almost imperceptible, the kind of shift that goes unnoticed by those preoccupied with routine. Ezekiel, already accustomed to visions that stirred the soul and silenced the mind, saw something that no priest ever hoped to witness and no prophet could bear lightly: the departure of the glory of God from the temple. This was not a vision cloaked in symbols or abstract riddles. It was painfully direct, the kind of clarity that sears rather than comforts. And yet, it unfolded with tragic patience, step by step, moment by moment, as if even in departure, God hesitated. The glory had once filled the sanctuary with overwhelming brightness, the same presence that had descended in the days of Solomon, that rested between the cherubim on the Ark of the Covenant, that lifted prayers like incense and made the holy place tremble. But now, Ezekiel watched as that same glory, the radiant weight of the divine, began to rise from the inner sanctuary. It paused above the threshold of the temple, as if waiting, as if looking back. It was not an explosion of wrath. It was the slow, grieving exit of a presence that had once made the temple a place of encounter and now found no home there. This was no ordinary departure. It was Ichabod in motion. The word itself, Ichabod, means the glory has departed. It had once been uttered in agony by the wife of Phinehas when the ark was captured, marking the loss of divine favor. Now in Ezekiel's vision, that moment was not simply repeated, but expanded. The glory moved from the sanctuary to the threshold, from the threshold to the gate, and finally, it ascended from the city altogether. Each stage was a warning, each pause an invitation for repentance that never came. Sin, over time, had made the temple uninhabitable for holiness. It was not sudden. The sacred had been slowly hollowed out by hypocrisy, idolatry, violence, and injustice. Rituals continued, sacrifices were still offered, but the heart had grown cold, and the presence that once filled the sanctuary with fire now found no resting place. God did not storm out in fury, he withdrew in sorrow. That distinction is critical. This was not abandonment born of indifference, but of grief. The temple was not merely a building. It was a covenantal meeting place. And when the covenant was broken, not once but continually, the relationship fractured. The glory could not remain where it was no longer welcomed. Ezekiel's eyes followed that glory. He watched it rise above the city like a cloud departing before a storm. To those in Jerusalem, unaware of what had been lost, life may have seemed unchanged. The outer appearance of religion remained intact. But what Ezekiel saw proved otherwise. The presence had left, and with it, the heartbeat of the nation. What remained was structure without spirit, form without flame. The temple still stood for a moment, but it was empty. Its sanctity had been traded for convenience, its purpose diluted by compromise. This moment was not only historical but deeply theological. It revealed that God's presence is not confined by architecture or tradition. He does not dwell where his name is uttered, but his will ignored. The departure of the glory was not punishment alone. It was the fulfillment of a pattern long warned about, a response to a people who honored God with their lips while their hearts were far from him. The vision burned not just as prophecy but as lament. And for Ezekiel, it must have been nearly unbearable to witness. Yet within the sorrow lies a lesson that echoes through time. The presence of God is precious beyond description. It is not automatic. It is not guaranteed by heritage, nor preserved by ritual alone. It is sustained by relationship, by holiness, by a heart turned toward the light. When that heart is given over to idols, whether carved in stone or formed in ambition, greed, or pride, the glory begins to lift, slowly, patiently, but it lifts. This vision speaks beyond ancient Jerusalem. It asks every soul to consider, is the presence of God still welcomed here? Not simply invited by words, but honored by obedience. The tragedy of Ichabod is not that God leaves out of wrath, but that he was grieved to do so. The heartbreak lies in how unnoticed his departure often is. The rituals continued, the songs were sung, but the glory had moved on. Ezekiel alone saw it. And through his eyes, the weight of that loss is still felt. When the glory of God departs, what remains is not neutral ground. It is vulnerable, exposed, and eventually overtaken. The fall of Jerusalem would come. The temple would burn. But the true loss had already happened when the presence departed. Everything that followed was only the visible collapse of what had already crumbled within. Still, even in this vision of departure, the pauses in the movement suggest something remarkable. God gave time, at the threshold, at the gate. At the mountain, he lingered. Mercy lingered. That delay was not hesitation, but grace. It was a final invitation, a last breath of hope. Though ignored, it revealed the heart of the one who does not wish to leave but must when holiness is persistently rejected. The silence left in the wake of divine departure was not the end of the conversation. Even as the glory lifted from the temple and Ezekiel mourned what few could see, a different kind of message began to stir, a promise not born of circumstances but of covenant. God, having made clear the gravity of rebellion, did not allow despair to close the story. Instead, he spoke again, not from a throne of judgment, but from a place of compassion. And what he declared through Ezekiel pierced deeper than any warning had done before. It was not a call for more offerings, not a list of rituals to reclaim favor, but a vision of transformation far more intimate and lasting. The people had turned their backs for generations, worshipped idols, profaned the sacred. But God spoke of something almost unimaginable, a new heart, Not symbolic reform or moral improvement, but a recreation of the very core of human desire and will. The prophet recorded it plainly. God would take the heart of stone from their flesh and give them a heart of flesh. This was more than poetry. It was a divine initiative to rewrite the human condition. A heart of stone does not feel, it does not respond. It is cold, unmoved, resistant. This was not simply a description of ancient Israel's spiritual state. It was the human condition stripped of grace. Hardness of heart cannot be softened by instruction alone. Law, no matter how perfect, cannot reach a heart that refuses to bend. What Ezekiel described was not behavior modification but rebirth. The change would not come from the outside in, but from the inside out. God would not only forgive their sins, He would make them new. This promise carried with it the full weight of divine mercy. It acknowledged the truth of what had gone wrong, yet refused to leave the people there. God did not dismiss their failures. He answered them with renewal. The heart of flesh was not merely symbolic of warmth or emotion. It was responsive, alive, tender to the voice of God. It could love again. It could be moved. It could worship not out of obligation, but because it desired the presence it once ignored. What Ezekiel was allowed to glimpse was a future where the law would no longer be something carved on stone tablets, kept behind a veil, but something etched into the living tissue of human hearts. No longer would righteousness be measured by adherence to outward codes alone, but by a life that flowed naturally from a transformed inner world. This was grace in its rawest, most revolutionary form. A God who does not wait for change but initiates it, who does not demand holiness and then watch from a distance, but who steps into the ruin and builds from within. This new heart also meant a new relationship. The promise continued. They would be His people, and He would be their God. This was not a contractual arrangement built on conditions, but a restored intimacy marked by presence. The same presence that had departed the temple would one day return, not merely to dwell in buildings, but in people. The sanctuary would be the human heart. The altar would be the conscience awakened by grace. The covenant would be renewed not by stone, but by spirit. For a people surrounded by exile, this promise was not simply comforting, it was revolutionary. Everything they had known had collapsed. The land, the monarchy, the temple, all gone. But in the ashes, a seed of hope was planted. God had not given up. More importantly, He had not left them to save themselves. The heart of stone would be removed, but not by human effort. It would be God's doing, His initiative, His mercy. The beauty of this vision lies in its reach. It did not belong only to Ezekiel's time. It echoed through generations, whispered through the prophets, and found voice in prayers and songs of longing. Psalm 51 verse 10 echoes the cry, "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me." The longing for a new heart is timeless, because the problem of the old heart is universal. And yet, in this promise, we are shown that no hardness is permanent when placed in the hands of the Creator. No rebellion is beyond redemption when grace begins its work. The stone can be shattered, and what replaces it is not weakness, but true strength, a heart alive, vulnerable, and willing to walk in the light. Ezekiel, the prophet of fire and visions, had now become the prophet of renewal. Through him, God unveiled not only the pain of judgment, but the tender depths of His love. A love that would not be satisfied with outward compliance. A love that refused to settle for distance. A love that desired to live within. The winds of the vision carried Ezekiel to a place unlike any he had seen before, a valley not marked by beauty or promise, but by desolation. It was not covered in grass or soil, but in bones. Dry, scattered, sun-bleached remains stretched across the landscape as far as the eye could see. The silence was different here. It was not the silence of peace or rest, but of abandonment. The kind of silence that follows long after the last cry has faded and the memory of life has been forgotten. God brought the prophet into the heart of this valley, not to mourn, but to witness what the human mind cannot easily grasp, the raw power of restoration. These bones were not recently fallen. They were not victims of a fresh battle. They were ancient, stripped of flesh, brittle from time and exposure. There was no movement among them, no suggestion of life. They spoke of finality. And then, in that graveyard of history, a question was asked not from man to God, but from God to man. Son of man, can these bones live? It was not a trick question, nor a request for logic. It was an invitation into mystery. Ezekiel, recognizing the limits of his own understanding, answered with reverence, "O Lord God, you know." With that reply, something extraordinary began. Ezekiel was instructed to prophesy, not to people, but to bones. Not to an audience waiting to be inspired, but to fragments of what once had been. His voice was to carry over that barren field and call life into what was beyond hope. As he spoke, a sound echoed through the valley, rattling, clattering, as bones began to find one another, connecting with tendons, clothed with flesh. Form returned, but still no breath. Bodies stood where bones had been, but they were not yet alive. They were whole in appearance, yet empty in essence. Then came the second command, to call on the breath, the ruach, the spirit. The same breath that hovered over the waters in the beginning, the same breath that filled the nostrils of Adam, was summoned again. It came from the four winds, and it entered them. What rose from the dust was not simply a gathering of figures, but an army, a people restored, a nation resurrected from despair. The breath turned structure into life. Without it, the bodies would remain still. With it, they stood upright, infused with purpose and identity. This vision was more than spectacle. It was a message to exiles who had forgotten the sound of their own name. A people who had once been chosen but now felt discarded, whose homeland lay in ruins, whose identity had been fractured by judgment and distance. To them, God spoke through bones. To them, He revealed that what seems lifeless is not beyond His reach. Restoration was not a metaphor, it was a promise. Ezekiel was told clearly, "These bones represent the whole house of Israel." Not just the righteous few, not just the visible remnant, but the entirety of a people who said, "Our bones are dried up, our hope is lost." God responded not with reprimand, but with resurrection. He promised to open their graves, to bring them back to the land, and to place His Spirit within them. It was not simply a return to geography. It was a return to identity, to covenant, to breath. This valley of dry bones speaks across time to all who feel buried by failure, who stand in the midst of spiritual drought and see only loss. It is a reminder that God does not measure hope by circumstances. He measures it by His word. When He speaks, even bones listen. When He breathes, even dust dances. What is striking about this vision is how participatory it is. God did not act alone. He told Ezekiel to prophesy. The prophet had to speak. The breath had to be summoned. The restoration did not bypass the human voice. It worked through it. In that, we glimpse the heart of divine partnership. God could have commanded the bones directly, but He chose to involve the prophet. This reveals not only the authority of the words spoken in obedience, but also the value God places on engaging humanity in the process of renewal. For those who carry despair in their chest like a stone, this vision stands as a declaration that nothing is too far gone. No story is too broken, no soul too dry. The God who once turned a battlefield of bones into a living army still moves through valleys today. He still speaks into places that others have given up on. He still breathes where breath has long been absent. Out of the silence that followed the vision of dry bones, as hope began to breathe again in the hearts of a scattered people, another word came to Ezekiel, one heavier in mystery, cloaked in symbols and names unfamiliar to the ears of his time. Gog, from the land of Magog, prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, rose not from the past but from the shadows of prophecy, embodying a final surge of defiance against the sovereignty of God. This was not a local enemy, not a familiar threat with borders and faces known. This was the face of ultimate rebellion, a force gathering across time, not bound to the maps of men, but to the spiritual currents that resist divine authority. Ezekiel was shown a vision not of subtle conflict, but of a massive confrontation, one that would emerge after Israel had been restored, after peace had begun to settle over the land. In that moment of security, a vast coalition led by Gog would march against a people no longer scattered but united, no longer broken but dwelling securely. The timing of this threat carried a deliberate weight. It would come not when Israel was weak, but when it was whole again. This enemy would not strike out of opportunity, but out of opposition to what God had rebuilt. The conflict was not simply about land or power. It was spiritual in essence, a resistance to restoration, a rebellion against reconciliation. The names in the prophecy, Magog, Meshech, Tubal, evoke ancient territories, but they also reach beyond them. Gog is portrayed not merely as a ruler, but as a symbol of evil raised up for the final demonstration of divine justice. The nations with him form a kind of unholy alliance, united not by geography or politics, but by hostility toward the people of God. They are well-armed, numerous, confident. They rise like a storm cloud over the land, believing their victory is certain. Yet, their strength is their illusion. What they do not account for is the one who watches. God declares that He's the one who will bring Gog forth. The very existence of the threat is under divine control. This is not chaos spiraling beyond God's reach. It is part of a greater unveiling. The battle that Gog seeks to wage is already known, already accounted for, already contained. God does not fear the multitude. He is not alarmed by the sound of their approach. He sees their hearts, their plans, their arrogance. And when they rise, He responds, not with delay, but with fury. Fire falls, mountains shake, the earth trembles. What was meant to be an overwhelming attack becomes a display of God's unshakable reign. This vision, complex and haunting, is not meant to terrify but to reassure. In revealing the scope of the final battle, Ezekiel is also revealing the depth of divine protection. Evil will rise, yes, but not unchecked. Opposition will come, but not unchallenged. The people of God will not be left defenseless. They will not be overwhelmed. The very fact that God foretells the attack is proof that it cannot surprise Him. Nothing that threatens His people is beyond His foresight. And in this revelation, the character of divine justice is revealed. Not passive, not reactionary, but active, decisive, and final. The imagery of Gog and Magog reaches far beyond Ezekiel. It echoes in later writings, whispered in apocalyptic language and echoed in moments of crisis when the world seems once again on the brink. But the message never changes. The conflict may grow fierce, the enemy may appear vast, yet the outcome is never in question. God defends what He restores. He protects what He redeems. The house of Israel, restored and breathing again, is not left exposed to the final onslaught. Instead, they stand not in their strength, but in the assurance that their defender watches without sleep. Ezekiel's role in delivering this vision is both profound and sobering. He is not only a prophet of restoration, but also a witness to the final resistance. His visions stretch from the bones of the past to the battleground of the future. In doing so, he becomes a bridge between hope and reality, between what God promises and what God defends. The enemy does not rise because God is absent. The enemy rises because the full display of God's justice has yet to be revealed. In this vision, the battlefield becomes a sanctuary, not because it is peaceful, but because it is under divine rule. The very place intended for destruction becomes the ground where glory is demonstrated. The defeat of Gog is not simply a military victory. It is the final word on evil, the end of opposition, the sealing of a promise that no power, no army, no alliance can overturn what God has decreed. From the aftermath of battle and the echo of divine justice, Ezekiel was led into a vision that could not have contrasted more sharply with the images of conflict and judgment that had come before. What he saw next was not fire falling from the heavens, nor armies defeated by divine power, but a river quiet at first, emerging from the threshold of the restored temple, flowing eastward with growing strength. It did not roar or crash. It moved with a kind of holy persistence, gaining depth not from tributaries or rainfall, but from within. This was no ordinary river. It did not rise from the mountains or the sea. It flowed directly from the presence of God. The river did not wait for invitation or permission. It moved forward, steady and purposeful, passing through the barren places, cutting through the dry lands. And wherever it went, life began to follow. Trees lined its banks, leaves rustling with a vitality untouched by seasons. These were not decorative. Their fruit came monthly, and their leaves were for healing, not metaphorical healing, but the restoration of what had been wounded, the reversal of desolation. The further the river flowed, the deeper it became, ankle deep, then knee deep, then waist deep, until it was too deep to cross except by swimming. The waters could not be controlled or measured by human effort. They had to be entered, experienced, surrendered to. Ezekiel, brought by his guide through this vision, was not merely shown geography, he was shown transformation. The land this river reached was the Arabah, the deepest and driest of valleys, known for its harshness and lifeless terrain. But when the waters of the temple reached it, even the salt waters of the Dead Sea were healed. Where nothing had lived before, fish swam in abundance. Nets were cast along the shores. Shores that once symbolized finality and barrenness now teemed with promise. This was not a vision confined to Israel alone. The river did not stop at the borders of the restored temple. It moved outward, pouring life into regions that symbolized hopelessness and stagnation. It touched the wilderness and transformed it. This was a vision of the reach of God's restoration, not limited to sacred spaces, but extending into the forgotten, the abandoned, the broken. The presence of God, once grieved and withdrawn, had now returned, not as a fire of judgment, but as a stream of renewal. The spiritual meaning of this vision pulses just beneath its surface. The river flowing from the temple is the presence of God made active, dynamic, healing. It does not remain in the sanctuary. It moves out into the world. This speaks not only to divine generosity, but to divine intention. God's goal was never to remain hidden behind walls. The restored temple becomes not an endpoint, but a beginning. The river is the visible expression of an invisible truth. Where God dwells, life flows. Ezekiel's vision invites more than admiration. It calls for response. The progression of the river's depth is not incidental. It mirrors the journey of the soul, first tentative, then immersed, then overwhelmed. The question is not whether the river flows, but how far one is willing to go into it. Spiritual transformation is not passive. It begins with stepping into the water, with letting go of what feels secure, and allowing the current of God's presence to carry and reshape. The trees on the banks of this river are not static either. They represent those nourished by divine life, constantly bearing fruit, providing healing to others. They are rooted not in effort, but in grace. Their growth is not seasonal, because the source of their strength is not external. The river sustains them from the inside out. This vision, serene as it appears, carries profound weight. It tells the story of reversal. What was dead lives again. What was bitter becomes sweet. What was isolated becomes connected. The curse of separation that began in Eden is here undone not by force, but by flow. The river does not need to conquer. It transforms simply by being present. And just as the glory of God once departed in sorrow, now his life returns in abundance. This river is the quiet answer to centuries of rebellion. It is the gentle yet unyielding symbol of hope that does not disappoint. It is the embodiment of the promise that God's presence is not just to be visited, but to be lived in, to be carried, and to be shared. The river flowing from the restored temple marked the beginning of something greater than renewal. It was the gateway into permanence. As Ezekiel's visions reached their crescendo, he was not left with fragments of glory or isolated glimpses of restoration. Instead, he was brought to behold a final sweeping picture of reconciliation and peace. What he saw was a new covenant written not only in words, but in the very structure of life itself. A land reordered, a sanctuary re-established, a people returned not only to geography, but to divine intimacy. Ezekiel was shown a detailed vision of the new temple, its measurements exact, its gates open to the east, the direction from which the glory of God would return. No longer did the vision tremble with threat or warning. Now it shimmered with fulfillment. The same glory that once lifted from the temple in sorrow now returned with finality, entering through the east gate, filling the house with radiant presence. And the voice declared that this place would now bear a new name. Yahweh Shammah, the Lord is there. This name was not symbolic, it was reality. No longer a place haunted by memory, the city became a dwelling of divine constancy. No longer a people trying to earn their way back, Israel stood secure in a covenant that God Himself had restored. The structures Ezekiel described, the courts, the altars, the sacred spaces, were not merely architectural. They were declarations of order in a world once torn by chaos. They spoke of belonging, of presence that does not depart, of worship that rises not out of fear, but out of joy. The restoration of the land was not simply national. It was cosmic. Boundaries were redrawn. Inheritance was reestablished. Justice was woven into the very fabric of daily life. Priests were given their place. The tribes were allotted their portions. And the temple stood at the center, not as a monument, but as a heartbeat. The holiness of God was not distant. It was near, accessible, permanent. In this closing vision, Ezekiel did not describe a dream. He recorded a reality waiting to be fulfilled. A vision that tells every wandering soul, you have a home. You are not forgotten. The covenant is not broken beyond repair. The Lord is not far away. He is there, in the heart that returns, in the worship that rises, in the justice that flows like a river, in the healing that spreads from His presence to the ends of the earth. This is the story of Ezekiel, one prophet, 3 realms: glory, judgment, and restoration, a witness to divine holiness, a bearer of divine grief, a herald of divine hope. Through fire, through silence, through visions and breath and bone, his life became a message not just for Israel, but for every generation that dares to believe that what was lost can be restored, that what was hardened can be softened, and that what was dead can live again. If this message has touched your heart, please take a moment to support this channel. Subscribe so you never miss a new message rooted in truth and hope. Like the video to help others find it. Share your thoughts in the comments. We would love to hear how this story spoke to you. And most importantly, share this video with someone close to you. You never know who might need to hear it today.